you. My apologies in advance. My paper is too long, and I will have to run a little bit quickly through the second part. And I was hoping to have a more indulgent chair, but I can see that Joe is very in danger to cut me off. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present some findings from a project that I started 2 years ago, and it is still ongoing, and it's about language choices, preferences, identity claims among second and third generation Italo Australians, and age between 18 and 30. The focus is to basically trying to find out how and to what extent and where they use the Italian and dialect, attitudes, sense of identification, and identify facilitating factors that could help assist in knowledge and use of the home languages. A major reason for this project is the current dearth of sociolinguistic studies in this area. And so we do have a fair bit of studies about post-war migrants and their children, and here is some references. And also more recent migrants are being studied currently, but this cohort that is quite crucial is really understudied. And another reason to actually focus on this cohort is because it allows us to make fruitful comparisons with findings that we have from the previous second generation, what throughout the paper I call the older generation, so people who are now in their 50s and 60s, and they are the children of the post-war migrants. So in terms of methodology, this project is based on a mixed method approach because I have a large corpus of quantitative data accompanied by in-depth interviews, and I want to acknowledge that my questionnaire is built on Baldassar and Al's questionnaire, and especially on a questionnaire by John Hajak and Francesco Voglia, and I take this opportunity to thank John and Francesco for letting me use their questionnaire. Thank you very much. So in the first part, I'm presenting some major results from the quantitative part of the project. In the second part, I'm presenting, if I can, I will be really very, very short, some preliminary analysis that I'm conducting of the qualitative part of the project, so of the interviews, drawing on recent developments in sociolinguistics. And this is really the part that is still quite underdeveloped and where I'm working on, okay? And I will talk about this later. So and I just want to say that one of the reasons why, and I just say this now up front, just in case I don't have time, the reason why I'm trying to embark upon this second part is because I think that we have to try and shift away from the prevailing use of the language shift, language maintenance paradigm that has been used in analyzing the intergenerational transmission of language across the transmission of languages across generations. So I'm not obviously the only one. For example, I'm thinking about Anne Powell's in her excellent book on language maintenance and language shift has put forth the idea that we should try and look at different paradigms, and particularly some new constructs, as I will try to argue later on, that can help us understand better the kind of linguistic processes that are occurring among the younger generation. And of course, Giorgio Bianco with his COD model, COD model, is obviously one of the prominent proposers also of alternative models. So this is the online survey that, in a fairly classic model of the sociology of language approach, collected data about sociodemographic information, attitudes, self-assessed competence, self-reported language use, and so on and so forth, with all the advantages and limitations of this kind of questionnaires that I'm sure most of you are all aware of, the fact that we're talking about perceptions and not actual use. And the fact that on the other side, though, this kind of surveys can provide us with a useful snapshot of general trends, of broad trends. So this is something that I wanted to say up front. The other thing is that following what John and Francesco's did, I actually introduced in the questionnaire some space for some more qualitative kind of data, comments, examples from the participants, and I will show you some examples of that. So This is just a snapshot of the participants, more females than males. Mean age, 22, almost 23, 6 years of age. 94 born in Australia. They could only proceed with the survey if they were. They could only proceed with the survey if they were younger than 6 years of age when they arrived here. I just read 1 minute. One interesting result that I want to point to is the fact that 82% of the sample had somehow encountered Italian as part of their learning experiences. Okay, now this was something that I asked participants to elaborate on, and what's interesting is that the kind of learning experiences that they faced were very, very different. So we had 1 or 2 teachers of Italian, so people who had actually, a very advanced competence of the language, down to people who had encountered Italian for very few years at primary level. Some who had done it throughout the high school. Some were self-taught as well. So this reflects, of course, the presence of Italian in the Australian educational system. The other thing I want to show you is social networks and contact with Italy. So one of the interesting results is the fact that 73% of the participants now move in the networks that are of friends of non-Italian background. That's an interesting comparison with what I was referring to, the older second generation that in fact had very much friendships mainly from Italian backgrounds. Okay. The other interesting thing here is that over 70% of the young people that participate in the survey had been to Italy either once or never. Okay? And from the interviews, what's coming out is that if they did go to Italy, it was once with the family when they were very young. So these are people that really have very little contact, if you want, with Italy itself. But as we will see, lots of indirect contacts. Overall, the sample is quite representative of post-war descendants in regional terms. The vast majority were participants from Sicily and Calabria, followed by Abruzzo, Campania and Veneto, and we know very well that these are the 5 regions that in the post-war migration yielded the highest number of migrants. The majority are third generation. It was grandparents that were born in Italy, and compared with what I was referring to as the older second generation, we notice higher education levels, and as I was saying before, more open social networks, and this encounter with Italian is in some forms throughout their educational experience. So the first graph that I show you is about their attitude. So the question was, how much do you like these languages? And the interesting thing is that you can see that Italian, in fact, seems, that's what they say, of course, again, it's perceptions, it's what they say, Italian seems to be more well-liked than English, just by a little bit. Dialect, as you can see, is a language that seems to be liked the least, or also towards which these young participants seem to have a fairly neutral kind of attitude. I just want to show you now just a little section of some of the qualitative data that I elicited through this questionnaire. And so when they were asked to write down 1 or more Italian or dialect words that they particularly liked, and these are some examples. And basically, if you look at the choice of the words, it really displays, these are the ones about in dialect, displays very much the strong affective bonds that these participants feel towards the languages, and also the strong associations, obviously, with the family. I don't have time to go through them, but you can have an idea. Okay, so what does Italian language mean for you? And again, more than one option was possible, both for Italian and for dialect. We'll see the next one. Family, culture and roots were the main values that these participants chose. And this is the one about dialect. So family was strongest for both, followed by culture for Italian and roots for dialect. Okay? So the lower motivation is useful, the instrumental value of these languages is lower. And the other interesting thing is that dialect is viewed as a secret language to communicate. Okay, let's move on now to the self-assessed language competence. overall, the participants are much more confident in their abilities in Italian than in dialect. And again, this is really a major difference with the older second generation, where the confidence was much more in their dialect skills rather than Italian skills. And for both languages, the higher confidence is displayed in receptive skills, understanding and reading, rather than speaking and writing, and this the lowest in writing. Okay, so let's have a look at the self-assessed competence of Italian. Sorry, just want to draw your attention about what I was saying before. Look at this, for example, speaking Italian and speaking dialect is quite a substantial difference, 36 versus 4, and understanding also. Okay, so there seems to be quite a shift away from dialect. Now, if we look at the self-reported use of languages, this was explored with a range of different interlocutors, as it's normally done in this kind of methodologies, but also in relation to different media. So I tried to capture also the social media use, and also in terms of content and frequency. Okay, so that's a little bit what I tried to explore. So, not surprisingly, in terms of speaking, the Italian dialect are used much more with the older family members, and that's something that we know also from previous studies. Parents, again, interestingly, the mothers, again, this is a result that we have found in lots of studies. The mother is the interlocutor, which is with whom Italian dialect is much more used. And then here you can just see very briefly, in terms of watching, listenings, what are the favorites songs in Italian films, websites, internet, DVDs in Italian. This is it's not very good, but it shows you the green is the English, and it shows you basically the overwhelming use of English, followed by Italian with a range of interlocutors in the family. Okay, so overall, participants report a fairly limited exposure to and use of Italian dialect, and higher with regard to Italian compared with dialect, as I was saying before. Now, the data was submitted to a statistical analysis, and these are the results of a regression analysis that tries to pull out the most significant variables. So gender, social networks, study of Italian, and some specific linguistic variables were those that emerged as of particular significance. Okay? Obviously, I don't have to go, I can't go through all this, but what I want to isolate a little bit is the study of Italian, which emerges as particularly interesting and seems to impact across different areas that were explored. So study of Italian was important, for example, for the meaning of languages. Italian is language of communication, makes sense. Of that, interesting also dialect as family language, self-assessed competence in those skills there, and self-reported use. Okay, so overall, generalizing a little bit the findings, you can see that these participants present themselves as more confident speakers of Italian and dialect. The impact of their Italian learning experiences in Australia, the emotional attachment to both languages, and the low instrumental value that they attribute to both languages, and more to dialect than to Italian. Okay, now in 5 minutes, I have to. Okay, I will just look a little bit at some brief excerpts from one interview that I've analyzed.
You have 8 minutes.
Oh, 8. Oh, that's very good.
Plenty of time.
Thank you so much. That's very generous. Okay. So obviously, what's happening? What I'm doing is I'm trying to use the interview as a way. The interview were collected as a way to go more in depth into some of the findings emerging from the survey. Okay, so the interviews were conducted through a series of fairly broad and open questions, and they explore the participants' linguistic biography, migration history of the family, perceptions of language competence and use, and so on. So the interviews were conducted by a young woman of Italian background. I've got 12 so far, and they are an extremely rich set of data. basically the fact that there was a lot of commonalities between the interviewer and the interviewee meant that the conversational nature of the event, of the speech event, was facilitated, and this really gave me a very, very rich set. Some of the interviews are over 2 hours long, okay? So it's a lot of data to analyze and to go through, and I've just started basically. So what I want to show you a little bit is some data taken from an interview conducted with Vincenzo, obviously a pseudonym, 20 years of age. Now, Vincenzo's grandparents came from Campania and Calabria, so that's quite interesting because it means that he was exposed to 2 different southern dialects that he often represents throughout the interviews as mutually incomprehensible. So he tells a lot of stories about these 2 sets of grandparents having conflicts about, in particular, in relation to words relating to food, okay? And a lot of misunderstandings about family, about the fact that there were these 2 different dialects, okay? It's a large transnational families because basically Vincenzo's relatives moved in Italy itself. He's got relatives all over Italy, but also in Australia, Sydney mainly, but also Melbourne, Queensland, Europe. He mentions France. His grandfather actually went to France first before coming to Australia, and South America. So like many other migrant families here. Okay, Brazil is one of the and Argentina is one of the countries that he mentions. So he talks about his grandparents. They came between the period of like 1950s to like 1960s, sort of. That's quite typical of the interviews when they actually are asked to talk about their grandparents. They know a little bit, but they seem to actually rehearse some kind of stories that I've heard in the family. It's a very, very close-knit family that live in the western suburbs of Sydney. And he's very close to his grandparents, nonnies, throughout the interviews. Oh, I love spending time with the nonni, always telling stories. And yeah, I always grew up with the nonni. I was really close, etc., etc. And yeah, very, very close. Also with the uncles, aunties, cousins. They all went to school together. So it's really that sort of sense of an extended family that has a lot of intense frequentation. Now, what I want to focus a little bit is on the identities that Vincenzo constructs throughout the interview in relation to Italian, okay? And again, this will be very, very quick. I'm taking identity as the social positioning of self and others, and I'm taking identity as something that can shift, that can change, that can be contradictory also throughout the interview. Now, I won't have time to go through the 3-4 excerpts that I prepared, but what I want to say is that in the excerpts that I'm showing you, and I've highlighted the words that I wanted you to focus on, is that Vincenzo seems to shift between positioning himself as a fairly confident learner of Italian, okay? In the sense that he presents himself as equipped with the tools to promote his learning of Italian, and a less confident user of Italian, and of speaking in particular. So throughout these excerpts, for example, the verb tries, I try, sometimes, on occasions, are the words that recur quite often. And the other thing that is interesting, that is the continuous references that he makes to the Italian I learned at school. Okay, so these are really 2 important points in the excerpts. Okay, so you can see here, for example, I try to get the lyrics of, for example, he listens to songs, he talks about listening to songs, watching TV with his grandparents, and I continue sort of. Okay? The other thing that is interesting is that Vincenzo, when he finished his high school, he actually started working with Italian butchers. Okay? So this workplace provided him with a context where he can use his knowledge of Italian. And so he's able to navigate between Italian and English. But again, while he puts himself in this position of sort of navigator, if you want, I mean, at the same time, he's also the learner that tries to learn with this encounter with the Italians that have recently migrated to Italy and work in this butcher. Given that I only have about 1.5 minutes, I want to show you 2 things. The first one is this. how do you feel when you speak Italian? I feel like an actual Vincenzo now, okay? Strong identity sense linked with the language. And the other one, I feel such an immigrant, and they both laugh, okay? So there's this idea of the language is so strongly connected with his background, with his family, etc. The other thing that I want to show you is the opposition that it creates at the bottom here. So this sense of security with Italian is because Italian has got rules. Dialects break rules, okay? So that's very interesting because actually our previous study that I conducted with an older second generation was exactly the opposite. She was a very confident speaker of dialect, and she was totally insecure because of having learned Italian. Okay, so that's very interesting how it's actually the opposite happening now. And dialects is like a rocket science in a sense, okay? Basically, I can understand it, it's confusing, terribly confusing. The other thing that I want to, and that's the last point that I want to show you, is how interestingly it looks at language mixing, or what we can call today translanguaging, as something very positive, okay? And that's, again, it's extremely interesting because normally the mixers themselves and other people are very highly censoring their own language mixing. Now, through the interview, what comes out is that Vincenzo, in fact, consider the language mixing of his own family. Vincenzo, metti la giacca or you catch a cold, as a positive way of building on his knowledge, as an effective way of communicating. Okay, and that's, again, I think it's quite an interesting point. So, going to the concluding remarks. Okay. I'll leave it there. Going to the concluding remarks, so we can say that both the quantitative and the small amount of qualitative data that I presented here point to positive attitudes towards Italian and to a lower extent dialect among these younger generations. And such attitudes in turn are underpinned by and large by the special and highly emotional links with such languages as part of their family's connections and more broadly of their cultural heritage. So in this sense, they can be considered heritage speakers if we consider the definition that Valdés gives of heritage language as languages with which individuals have a personal connections. Now, as we have seen, the study of Italian is an important element that contributes to imbuing a sense of linguistic security, and we're seeing through this shifting positioning. And of particular interest, I just want to highlight about two things. First, that Vincenzo seems to construct the languages that he knows as resources, okay? As resources that he can draw on. He doesn't see the languages as, although he has this idea, it seems to have a strong language ideology of Italian dialect English in a way that seems to point to purism. On the other hand, when he talks about this kind of translanguaging that he does and that his family, he looks upon it as another resource, effective resource, and as a way of building on his knowledge. So he seems to look at his repertoire as something flexible, dynamic, that can change, it can be enriched, and as bilingualism as a condition that can change throughout his life. And these are actually notions that the sociolinguistics currently is putting forth. And so I'm proposing that some of these can be quite useful when we look at these younger generations. And I just want to conclude by saying that I was saying before, the COD model that John proposed of the competence, opportunity, and D for desire, motivation, as a way of revitalizing languages seems to apply very well to cases like Vincenzo and others in the interviews. Thank you very much. Sorry.